C.Simmons with you here on the 21st day of July in the year of our Lord 2018 with the CSTV Horse Racing 2018 report. And what we're getting into right now is what seems to be the leading candidate in terms of Justify's future. The Triple Crown winner, it would appear that the number one option at this point, given the developments in his condition with the ankle filling that subsided and then has now been re-aggravated and has redeveloped into a second series of swelling issues, would seem to be that retirement is, at the head of affairs in terms of what his future is, which is code word for he won't ever run again. And the last burning memory of him would be crossing the finish line first to complete the Triple Crown in the Belmont Stakes on June 9th in the year of our Lord 2018. And that seems to be the likely progression. The risks, outweigh the benefits when you have a horse, regardless of whether he's a Triple Crown horse or a top stakes a top stakes competitor. That is, something that, there's always a risk when you're dealing with horses whose tendons are as thin as, the ones in our wrists, carrying excessive weights of anywhere from 1,000 and in Justify's case, almost 1,300 pounds going at tremendously high speeds. So it's, you have riders sitting on top of these incredible thoroughbreds that are always followed around the racetrack by an ambulance. So, the dangers are something that aren't talked about, but it's part of the business. And nobody wants to see, a catastrophic ending or an event unfold, the likes of which we saw with Barbaro. Nobody wants to see that. That's what trainers have in the back of their mind. Not so much Barbaro, but a horse just breaking down. I think that the situation, without having direct evidence and being around the Baffert barn and Jimmy Barnes, his assistant, and the whole team, that the situation may be as potentially career and possibly life-threatening as that. I'm not, I believe these individuals are, great caretakers of these horses. I'm not so sure that that the situation, but I think that, it's a situation of let's proceed with extra caution when you have a Triple Crown winner. It's a lot like when Barbaro broke his leg in so many places in the 2006 Preakness. Normally, the everyday horse is going to be put down, but Barbaro was a Kentucky Derby winner, and something needed to at least attempt to be salvaged, and he hung in there for a little while. And Dr. Dean Richardson did a lot of, there was a lot of long-term benefits from in dealing with a horse like that, and how far you can go in treating a horse that otherwise wouldn't even be put on the examination table. But there were a lot of great things that came out of that, even if you think from a practical standpoint, despite the fact he was a Derby winner, that he needed to suffer, any longer, which is what most people would think a horse with that type of injury is going through. But whether it be Dean Richardson or Bob Baffert or, any of your top conditioners, and the team and the group around those teams, these horses are pretty well taken care of. And so even for those who think that Bob Baffert might be, doling out or releasing a series of cover stories, knowing that Justify all along, if he could win the Triple Crown, was going to probably be whisked away to the breeding shed sooner than later, and that we need to come up with some excuse rather than being straight up and saying, look, we'd like to run them, but we're probably not going to run them. I think there are a lot of frustrated bloggers and even some journalists and casual observers that would say, well, just be, just tell us straight up, give it to us straight. What's the situation? And even if we don't like what we're hearing, at least, people can respect that you're being honest. I'm not the one of those in the camp that believes that Baffert is really putting on. We just don't know. It's very conceivable that the horse will compete again, and that they're just really being cautious, and that they can put together some sort of plan B or plan C, some sort of very accelerated plan on a condensed scale. Obviously, everything that we speculated, whether it be just the simple carbon copy campaign that American Pharoah was put on after the Triple Crown, Haskell, Travers, and I think they wanted to run him somewhere else, but he lost to Travers. It was a hard race, and they made a decision to give him the break until the Breeders' Cup. Most people would think that that is the projected path because it's worked before, with Justify. The year after, American Pharoah was able to take the break from the Travers to that, Arrowgate did the same thing for Bob, for Team Baffert, and they won the Classic, beating California Chrome in a thrilling stretch duel there. So, it's a formula that's been tried, tested, and proven twice. So, that I think initially was the scenario that most people projected. It's a scenario that deep down you really don't want, because you don't want that kind of a prolonged break between the Midsummer Derby and the Classic with a 3-year-old like this. But at the same time, whether it's a Triple Crown winner or a top-level Grade 1 horse, it is a plan that can work on many levels. I think that given what Bob Baffert said about Justify, between the Preakness and the Belmont, and how he recovered from it better than Pharoah did in terms of his fitness and his recuperation and his recuperative powers, you would think that he's a sturdier enough horse to where my assessment in terms of mapping out a plan were a little bit more ambitious. And in other words, 4 races after the Triple Crown versus 3, because I believe he's a horse with the kind of iron constitution that could pull it off. And the 4 races initially before this ankle injury surfaced was the Haskell, the Midsummer Derby, the Travers, the Jockey Club Gold Cup, Breeders' Cup Classic. 3 of the 4 races at 1.25 miles. I believe he could handle that. I think he likes that distance. And, keep in mind, the Jockey Club Gold Cup is a weight for age. He would get 121 pounds at Belmont Park, a track we know he likes. So and obviously you hope that he can avoid being a victim of being one of the, of the graveyard of favorites that is Saratoga, and that he would run well in the Travers and not, be delivered the same fate that American Pharoah, that happened to American Pharoah, that he would fall into that category and end up joining that mass grave that includes Secretariat and Man of War and Pharoah and quite a few other favorites sitting at that cemetery at Saratoga Springs. You would think that maybe Justify could overcome all of that, but now that curse is not even, in the cards, according to Baffert. The Haskell is off the table, as is the Travers. And the ultimate spot, and I will lay this out to you in terms of another theory or another, plan of attack, competition-wise, was Haskell, Woodward take the week after, run the week after the Travers, let the other 3-year-olds beat each other up and bang each other up, going 1.25 miles, carrying 126 pounds. We'll go 1.125 miles again after hopefully being successful in the Haskell, carrying only 121 pounds. Use that as a tightener against the older horses with the weight allowance, and then go to Belmont Park and run 1.25 miles and use that as the springboard, as the momentum, prep for the Breeders' Cup Classic, knowing that he likes Belmont Park, and then going to Churchill, where it all began with, at the Kentucky Derby in the Classic, where, of course, the Breeders' Cup is going to be held in Louisville at Churchill Downs. So that, to me, I felt was a great path. Another one would be Haskell Pacific Classic, where you would hook, Accelerate, who's more than likely, if all goes well, going to run in that race after running this weekend, in which this podcast is being presented. In the San Diego, which is the local prep at Del Mar for the Pacific Classic. For Justify, meeting Accelerate in the Pacific Classic in and of itself would be a marquee event. Haskell, Pacific Classic, awesome again, cutting back to the 1.125 miles at Santa Anita Oak Tree, and then shipping to Churchill for the Classic. Now, I'm not as big a proponent for running 1.25 miles and then going back to the 1.125 miles, but some trainers believe going back to the 1.125 miles keeps them sharp, and you can still gallop out the 1.25 miles without literally going through the effects of a 10 furlong race. I like the upward trend, the upside of going, in Justify's case in the first scenario, 1.125 miles in the Haskell, 1.125 miles in the Woodward, and then the 1.25 miles go up the ladder to the 10 furlongs, and then, smooth out the rough edges in the interim, and then run even better in the Classic, if that's possible, because I believe a lot of people were really eagerly anticipating Justify being able to improve as a horse, or certainly maintain that level as an improving 3-year-old, because many sophomores get better as the year goes along, And some horses really come into their own into the fall and then grow into great 4-year-olds if they are, of course, allowed to, be in a position to campaign as handicap horses the following year. And we all know that if things really had gone perfectly for Justify, he would be on a path not only to the Breeders' Cup, but maybe run one more time in the Pegasus. Now, the best case scenario news would be that WinStar Farm, China Horse Club, Starlight Racing would say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to see if we can make the Breeders' Cup, but we're going to make a concerted effort to try to make the Pegasus next year and then continue to run them as a 4-year-old. People would love to hear that. Remember, Seattle Slew and Affirm ran as 4-year-olds after winning the Triple Crown. But now things have just changed where, unfortunately, that fun, that element of fun and, and added excitement, must-see, TV, reality TV, box office, type of, competition is not as preeminent as it used to be. And a lot of it has to do with economics. There's just more $1 million races and you can earn, twice the money, 3 times the money in less time. You just don't have to race as much. That's one, and we'll talk more about that in the future about why horses don't run as much as they used to. It's not just necessarily a case of weakening of the breed, if that's even as legitimate as everybody, even myself included, have diatribed and dissected over the years because of the frustration, rather than looking at it a little bit more logically and more more clairvoyantly. So right now with Justify, that would be ultimate news to see, they make an announcement, but don't get your hopes up. I mean, just realistically, as I said before, the leading candidate is for him to retire. But what would be ideal is in a short window of time, we can still get a little bit of Justify juice and be able to do the Justify jig upon him performing the way he did in the Triple Crown. And right now, the best scenario is with those scenarios off the table. Haskell, Travers, Gold Cup, Breeders' Cup Classic, Haskell, Woodward, Gold Cup, Breeders' Cup Classic, Haskell, Pacific Classic, Awesome Again, Breeders' Cup Classic. Or even a situation, because he probably wouldn't have, in the best case scenario, run in the Haskell and then skip the Travers to run in the Pennsylvania Derby, although that is a possibility, and then run in the Breeders' Cup Classic. That's probably a little bit on the lower end of the totem pole, but right now it would appear that what we may see is Justify and his camp point to the, they might try to make the Pennsylvania Derby, and then upon that long layoff, everything has to go that much more perfectly. It has to be a perfect scenario in terms of the preparation, how the race unfolds, how he comes out of it, because then he's going to get about a 6-week break to smooth out any rough edges for the Breeders' Cup Classic. But that might not leave him fit enough, although Justify is a tremendous workhorse. So that could work. It's not to say that it couldn't work, and it may be more successful than when Baffert ran West Coast in the Travers, the Pennsylvania Derby, and the Breeders' Cup Classic. That formula actually worked for Bayern in 2014 when he beat California Chrome. Ran poorly in the Travers, beat California Chrome, beat him like a bass drum in the Pennsylvania Derby, and then beat him again in the Classic, even though he wiped out part of the field right at the break, including the late Share Belief, who many people thought was a superstar in his own right. He had beaten older horses in the Pacific Classic that summer and trying to get himself back into the 3-year-old picture after missing the Classics. It was ridden by Mike Smith, the current Triple Crown winning jockey of Justify. But that format has worked for but those horses ran in the Travers and the Pennsylvania Derby. Obviously, the Travers is off the table for Justify. He would come into the Pennsylvania Derby with no prep and just works. And we don't know, given what's going on now, to the extent of how much he would be able to get in that would get him fit enough to at least run up to, an acceptable level in the Pennsylvania Derby and then take another break of about almost 7 weeks for the Breeders' Cup. That might leave him, but it might be just enough. Maybe that's what he needs, even though he's a horse that seems to be sort of a point-given type that could thrive on more activity. Actually running in these 2 races, and given the way he trains, that could be enough for him, even though that we feel like, many would feel that's a very thin schedule, and it's also a very, it's also one in which wiggle room and perfection everything, there's a little bit, wouldn't say pressure is the word, but things do just have to fall a little bit more correctly when you don't have as much time to develop the horse through competition. As Bob Baffert said a long time ago, one race is better than 5 works or 10 works because it sharpens a horse up. So here's the theory that I think at this point would be the best one. Now, also, in that this is kind of on the bottom end, and this is now looking more like the more viable situation in terms of calling an audible at the line of scrimmage, like any good quarterback, and that is running him. Perhaps, maybe he does. I mean, like I said, he can't make the Woodward, the Pennsylvania Derby, Breeders' Cup Classic. Again, that's one of the top scenarios now at this point. But to me, it would feel like instead of sitting with Jimmy Barnes, if you're Bob Baffert and the rest of the team, including Elliott Walden, who is a top-notch trainer, trained Victory Gallop to nipped Bob Baffert and denied him a Triple Crown just by the thinnest of noses in 1998 when Victory Gallop got up in the last jump to beat Baffert's Real Quiet. He is, of course, the head the manager of racing operations at WinStar, one of the principal and primary owners of Justify. In sitting down and strategizing a plan, it would appear that someone of reasonable mind and sound decision making would say, you know what, wait a minute, we don't have to literally run him and put us much pressure on ourselves to make a stake and to run him in a stake. We could run him in a conditions race at Del Mar toward the end of the meet in September, or at Oak Tree as it opens its scheduled menu of races, and he could run there, be able to refamiliarize himself with Santa Anita, get a good race over the track at 8 or 8.5 furlongs, set him up for the 9, and hook accelerate if he's there and whoever's there in the Awesome again, and that could be enough, and ship on out to Kentucky to be ready to deliver that supersonic performance, and basically explode, give us that explosion that he showed in the Triple Crown to an even higher level, which theoretically in the Breeders' Cup you're going to have to do, because when looking at the Breeders' Cup, not only theoretically, but from a historical standpoint, you're running against, in many ways, better horses. That's the way it would appear. 3-year-olds that are improving and the older horses. Although it could be argued that some of the horses, by the time you get to the Breeders' Cup, are on a downward trend. Lemon Drop Kid's a great example in 2000, although at his best he would have been hard-pressed to beat those 3-year-olds of 2000. Tis Now, Giants Causeway, Captain Steve, Albert the Great. Keep in mind, Fusaichi Pegasus, who had won the Derby in a manner in which he lived right up to his name. It looked like wings were sprouting off of him in the stretch. He was so devastating in that race. It looked like he had Triple Crown written all over him. Didn't run very much after he lost the Preakness. He was the favorite, and he finished 6th. Lemon Drop Kid was sandwiched in the middle of the top 4, finishing 5th. So, when you have a year like that, which this could be one of those years, even for those who have not been high on the 3-year-olds or who were high on them, and then when things sort of fell apart for a few of them, people think, oh, maybe they're not that good, and the narrative has suddenly changed, from being a crop with depth to, to another story where going into the Belmont, which one of these horses can beat Justify, everybody, kind of taking the position of who's going to beat Justify, to when he finally beat him again for a 3rd straight time, and in many cases, most of the horses a 2nd time, because a few of them skipped the Preakness. Then everybody says, well, he didn't beat much. So it went from, the narrative changing from 1 to 2 to 3 different things. And, people are still out there saying, well, he didn't beat much, but, that's not what everybody was saying before the race, that thought that every one of those horses had a chance to beat him. So, again, this still could be a year, even if Justify doesn't make it, where these 3-year-olds could really, really, as I said, going into the Triple Crown, could really be viable at the end of the year. As Charles C. Canty said a long time ago, in the early years of the Breeders' Cup, 3-year-olds have done very well in the Breeders' Cup, in the Classic. And not to mention, some of these horses will also float out and cut back from route races, in addition to horses that are running, in the middle distance, that can, in their minds, navigate the mile and run in the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile. We'll see a couple of them switch to the turf as well. We may even see a horse like Gronkowski, who finished 2nd in the Belmont, appear on the Breeders' Cup turf. He seems to like a mile and a half. He might be a horse that could prove that that's not his Belmont run was not a one-hit wonder. So he could be viable on both surfaces, or Chad Brown may perhaps maybe put a little more emphasis on running on the turf. We'll just have to wait and see. I think Hofberg is a horse that also has potential to run on each surface. He comes from an operation. Now, he might not be completely, a perfect fit for it, but he comes from an operation of Judd Mott Farms that's a powerhouse, as we know, based out of Europe on the turf, that's also increased their presence on the dirt as well, with Arrogate, of course, at this point being their best horse on the dirt. And we all know what his resume entails before he tailed off. So, in looking at Justify, I think that it's conceivable, but we have to be realistic in these times that horses are whisked away. Smarty Jones didn't even win the Triple Crown in 2004. Didn't win the Triple Crown. And as Aaron Greider said when watching in the race replay, when Smarty Jones, 3.5 length lead evaporated in the stretch, little by little as that aorta bursted in deep stretch, he just couldn't hang on after being roasted on the front end. Every single horse, in there, it almost felt like no one was trying to win the race. They were all sacrificial lambs trying to take down Smarty Jones. You still have to probe some of the riders, including Jerry Bailey, who rode Eddington that day, as to what really was the main objective. Because certainly trying to win the race didn't seem to be at the top of the list of things of goals that day. But either way, Smarty Jones lost the Belmont to Birdstone, and he was a horse that, as Mike Battaglia said, didn't need help. He didn't need the ideal post position. And in addition to the fact, prior to losing the Belmont, as he once said, when a horse is undefeated, you got to respect him, which is interesting because there are a lot of people that still don't respect Justify for being an undefeated Triple Crown winner, joining Seattle Slew in that department, and very exclusive company amongst the exclusive 13 Triple Crown winners, and the first one to be an undefeated Triple Crown winner or Triple Crown winner of any sort without any 2-year-old foundation, without having run as a 2-year-old. But what's interesting is with Smarty Jones, coming into the Belmont, he was undefeated, and you got to respect a horse like that. So even after he lost the Belmont, he didn't get a chance to redeem himself later on. The Pennsylvania Derby, being that he was based in Pennsylvania, John Service was based there primarily, while being a top trainer in the tri-state area with his occasional forays to Churchill and Belmont and Saratoga and so forth with nice horses prior to Smarty Jones, which included Jostle, who was a great filly from 2000. That would have been a great homecoming for Smarty to run in the Pennsylvania Derby, because where it was placed, he could have also possibly, re-engage and rematch with Birdstone as well. Worst case, even if he didn't run at Saratoga, Pennsylvania Derby would have been an ideal spot to get him going toward the Breeders' Cup, which I think he would have had a good chance to do well in. And unfortunately, he was retired. It came and went so quickly. And that's kind of what people are feeling with Justify, although it seems like people are it could be argued, a little more upset about it. And I think that may be splitting hairs, but at the same time, to be honest with you, people are frustrated when they see this year after year after year. It's just, a trend that it's like prison. You just never get used to it. Not that I've done prison time or anybody listening to this. Hopefully you haven't been incarcerated for any period of time. 5 minutes in jail is not something you really want to have to deal with. And I think many years, whether you're a Nuance fan, a fan who's come into the picture in the last 10 years, 12 years,